We now move to our panel on climate impact and adaptation. And here our panelists, Kip Batten, our Counselor on Science for the Department of the Interior. Next to her is David Hayes, Deputy Secretary for the Department of the Interior. And next to David is Sam Hamilton, the Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next to Sam is Ann Castle, the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science. And next to Ann is Larry Echohawk, the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, who has a very busy week ahead as we're doing a whole host of things with the President and the nation's first Americans. So we are now going to do this climate impact and adaptation panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Kip Batten. I want to make just a comment about this general issue. Climate change is a real issue that we have to deal with, and they are not only interrelated, they're the same issue. When we talk about energy and we talk about climate change, we need to make sure that we are addressing the new energy frontier and also addressing the reality of climate change, which we are facing. For me, as I came on as Secretary of the Interior and have had the opportunity to see lots of different places around the country over the last 9 months, I can tell you that when I go to the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin and I meet with our parks people and the tribal nations there, they talk to me about the fact that Lake Superior is now 5 degrees warmer than it was 30 years ago. And when I fly over to Montana with Senator Tester and with Senator Baucus, and we fly over Glacier National Park, and our people there are telling us that by the year 2020, there will be no more glaciers at Glacier National Park. And then when I travel through the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River system from the headwaters in my home state of Colorado all the way to California, and the water users, both Democrat and Republican, are all saying, what are we going to do when we have 20% less water in the Colorado River Basin, a river which is already extremely water short and for which compacts were negotiated with huge underestimates of the reality of water there. So we have to deal with this issue. It is a signature issue of our time, and that is why energy and climate change is at the heart of what President Obama is attempting to do as one of the signature issues for our world and one of the signature issues for our country. And with that, we'll turn it over to Kip Batten. Kip.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Today we're going to be looking at a multimedia presentation. Part of it will take place on the main screen here and part on the smaller screen over there. For the folks who are watching online, you'll get to see the video but not the PowerPoint slides. Apologize for that, but that's the way it's going today. And I want to especially thank Colin Walsh and Camilla Hennetu for making this multimedia presentation work. So Secretary Salazar recently launched the Department of the Interior's first ever coordinated strategy to address the impacts of climate change on America's land, ocean, water, wildlife, cultural, and tribal resources. So it's a very broad-ranging strategy. This climate change strategy coordinates the work of all of the departments, bureaus, and offices, but it also depends on partnerships with many of you. We hope to be partnering with other federal agencies, tribal governments, state governments, local governments, private entities, universities, and NGOs, just to name a few. In signing Secretarial Order 3289 on September 14th of this year, Secretary Salazar noted that across the country, Americans are experiencing firsthand the impacts of climate change, from growing pressure on water supplies, to more intense droughts and fires, to rampant bark beetle infestations. This video and PowerPoint presentation first will provide background about why the Secretary took this action and about the Department of the Interior's role in confronting the impacts of climate change through working on science, adaptation, and mitigation efforts. Why Interior? Well, Interior manages 1 out of every 5 acres in the United States, 35,000 miles of coastline, millions of acres of marine parks, refuges, and monuments, and as you heard earlier, oversees 1.7 billion acres of the ocean on the outer continental shelf. And we employ many of the nation's top scientists. This global visualization on the screen over here shows how Interior's scientific expertise, data resources, and geospatial capabilities help the department to understand, anticipate, and deal with the impacts of climate change. The reds and yellows on the spinning globe over here show how the world's climate is changing. This imagery shows temperature increases compared to historic average temperatures. Since the mid-1970s, the average surface temperature of the globe has warmed about 1 degree Fahrenheit, and that's just the average. Temperatures in the Arctic have increased at almost twice that same rate over the past 100 years. The 10 warmest years since 1880 have all been within the last 12 years, from 1997 to 2008. This warming is leading to dramatic impacts that we are already experiencing around the globe. An example of these impacts is the greater variability in weather, including more drought, stronger storms, and more extreme weather occurrences. And if Camilla, if you could go back one slide. This map over here on the video screen shows occurrences of large hail in yellow, tornadoes in red, extreme windstorms in green, and hurricanes in blue. And although that's a little bit hard for you all in the audience to see, these are all extreme weather events. So we're talking about hail that's greater than 2 inches in diameter, for example, as shown in this photo here. Sea ice, glaciers, and permafrost are also disappearing. The diminishing of Arctic sea ice has been extreme over the past 30 years. The red line on the screen over here shows the current extent of the Arctic sea ice as of September 2008. The tan color is the extent in September 1979. Because of climate change, the permanent or year-round sea ice is shrinking. In addition, many of the world's 8,000 glaciers are retreating. What you're seeing here on this globe as it's spinning are green dots, and these represent the 8,000 glaciers that we currently have around the globe. Again, apologies for that being rather small. U.S. geoscientists have monitored the melting of South Cascade Glacier in the state of Washington and that of several glaciers in Alaska for the past 50 years, yielding the longest such record in North American history. The South Cascade Glacier has shrunk dramatically during the past 50 years. On the screen over here, the blue and yellow lines show the current extent of the glacier compared to the purple, which shows the glacier's extent 50 years ago. Temperature increases are also leading to thawing permafrost, or permanently frozen ground found in cold regions such as Alaska. Right here you can see discontinuous permafrost, where the permafrost is melting in certain areas. The water here is showing that discontinuity. The colors over here on the video screen represent different depths and stability levels of permafrost. The blue colors show where the most rapid melting is occurring and where the permafrost is discontinuous. Permafrost, as you know, contains a great deal of carbon. So as it melts and as organic matter in it decomposes, it releases even more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, leading to a cycle which generates even more greenhouse gas emissions and more global warming. The warmer temperatures are not only causing glaciers and land ice to melt and so raising sea level, but are also causing the temperature of the seawater itself to increase, causing it to expand at a rate of about 1/10 of an inch per year. This combination of both of these events is leading to scientists predicting that we may see a 1 meter sea level rise this century. What's shown in yellow over here along the Florida coastline represents what would be flooded under a 1 meter sea level rise. Note that the Everglades would be flooded, as would wetlands and wildlife around New Orleans, and that many other areas on both coasts would be affected. This type of information is essential for designing strategies to protect our low-lying coastal communities. Think how massive the effects would be on our culture as coastal communities move inland. Changing temperatures across the globe cause a variety of other effects as well. For example, scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service are seeing changes in animal populations and behavior. Until recently, for example, nearly the entire population of this sea goose here, the Pacific brant, overwintered in Mexico. But now, as many as 30% are choosing to spend their winters in Alaska instead. Another result of climate change includes more forest damage from insects. For example, populations of pine bark beetles in national parks and other public lands in the West are increasing and killing trees. The dead trees in turn become fuel for more intense wildfires. The yellow areas over here on this screen indicate the dead trees as a result of beetle kill. Interior and its agencies have been monitoring these types of climate change impacts in a number of ways, including satellite imagery. In October of 2008, the USGS opened its full Landsat satellite data archive to the public at no charge. The data came from the Earth Resources Observation and Science Center, or EROS, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. What type of data are we talking about? The data in the previous Landsat images that showed pine bark beetle kill, and also images such as this one, one more, Camilla, such as this one, looking at population growth in Las Vegas over the past 35 years. So this is in May 1973, and then the next slide, in 2006. So quite tremendous. The population can also download images from the 7,500 USGS real-time stream gauges located throughout the nation. This network of gauges is vital to climate change research and response. These data stations provide 100-year records to document and observe flood conditions, and they're shown over here in those blue dots on the screen. What we're about to see here is a real-time data station in California, and it's too hard for you to see, but you can access all sorts of real-time data coming from individual stream gauges across the country. And this is the type of data that the public has access to. The public can also access ice core data. At the USGS National Science Foundation Ice Core Lab in Denver, scientists are also studying ice cores from the Arctic to the Antarctic that reveal temperatures and concentrations of greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, over the past tens of thousands of years. The Department of the Interior's interest in climate change includes science of current and future climate change impacts, adaptation, and mitigation. That's because the department and its agencies have responsibilities for 1/5 of the land in the United States and must manage it with an eye towards the future. On the small screen over here, you get an idea of the extent of our land management responsibilities. On this map, the purple shows the National Park Service areas, green shows the Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, yellow indicates Bureau of Land Management responsibilities, and brown shows the Outer Continental Shelf, and red our tribal stewardship responsibilities. In addition, the department is the largest wholesale water provider in the nation, supplying drinking water to more than 31 million people and irrigation water to 140,000 farmers. Here are the locations of all of our dams, and here, zooming in, is the location of the famous Hoover Dam. Let's look at some of the ways that Interior is working to monitor, forecast, and adapt to the effects of climate change right now. We zoom in now, over here on this screen, to the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge on the lower coastal plain of North Carolina on the Albemarle Peninsula. This refuge is home to many endangered species, including the endangered red wolf. Recent modeling shows that because of sea level rise, the refuge will lose up to 67% of its swamp and 90% of its dry land by 2100. How does one even prepare for these changes? Well, Fish and Wildlife Service right now is working to restore wetland hydrology in these areas, as well as reinforce and restore existing habitat, both along the coast and inland, and are also helping protect the coast by restoring oyster reefs along the coast to protect from higher storm surge. National Park Service is currently engaged in an assessment of conditions called NPScape. NPScape will identify landscape scale measures to adapt to the impacts of climate change, working cooperatively with landowners adjacent to parks. Another example is the Bureau of Land Management's work to remove invasive plant species like cheatgrass in the areas shown in yellow over here on this map. Cheatgrass and other non-native invasive plant species have become a major problem by invading the West and becoming fuel for wildland fires. What's more, before the invasion of cheatgrass, these areas in the Great Basin, such as those shown in yellow, were actually carbon sinks as ecosystems. However, with the increase in fire frequency as a result of the invasion of cheatgrass, that's actually turned these systems into carbon sources. So BLM is removing these invasive species and working to restore native vegetation. This effort will increase the amount of carbon stored in these ecosystems, reduce atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, and provide a number of different ecosystem services. In Appalachia, the Interior's Office of Surface Mining is increasing carbon sequestration in soils and plants by reforesting mined areas. Over the past 3 years, more than 49,000 acres have been reforested, including approximately 30 million trees planted. And you can see some of those areas over here on the small screen. Interior is working with our many partners to improve our understanding of climate change impacts and to better communicate this information. For instance, Interior scientists are working with other federal and state agencies, universities, and other partners to create standard reference data sets for agencies inside and outside of Interior. One back. Oh, technical difficulty. Okay, for example, they have made a shared data set available on terrestrial ecosystems, which shows ecosystem types across the United States. I apologize for not having that slide. So, this new secretarial order builds on the collective experience of Interior scientists and managers through regional climate change centers, landscape conservation cooperatives, and other innovations, and we're about to hear more about that from the panel. And right now I'd like to turn this over to the Deputy Secretary of the Interior, David Hayes. Thank you.
I always feel a little bit unprepared following Kit Batten. I'm a lawyer, so the idea of PowerPoints and pretty pictures is a bridge too far for me. But thank you all for being here. I want to speak very briefly about how we are trying to grapple with this enormous challenge of the climate impacts on our resources. As Kit illustrated, I think, very effectively, we at the Department of the Interior are really on the front lines of this issue, and the Secretary talked from his personal experience about that point. But think about it for a minute. In terms of resource impact from climate change, we, being the stewards of 20% of the landmass of the United States, the largest water provider in the United States, the primary agency with stewardship responsibilities over wildlife, not only on the public lands but also on the private lands through the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Endangered Species Act, et cetera. To the extent that climate change is affecting our resources, we have to be in the front lines. We are in the front lines of this. This is something that the Secretary identified early in the administration. And we took sort of a two-part approach to it. First, the Secretary very early in March set up an Energy and Climate Change Task Force and issued an executive order on that, establishing the task force and kicking off the renewable energy side of the coin that we talked about in the first panel. The second chapter of that has been the climate change impact side. And as Kit alluded to, the Secretary on September 14th issued a very important secretarial order that I commend you to look at on our website called Addressing the Impacts of Climate Change on America's Water, Land, and Other Natural and Cultural Resources. What this is about is how to organize our department to adapt to the impacts of climate change. It has a couple of other features too I'll deal with briefly, but first let's talk about the adaptation side. This is really hard because we have not encountered as a nation, as a world, the impacts on our resources that are potentially so destabilizing and so difficult to figure out essentially how we should turn. Sea rise that may inundate the Everglades, wildlife impacts that may lead to the potential extinction of polar bears and pikas. How do we react? How do we adapt? The secretarial order has a couple of fundamental principles in it. First of all, it says we have to react to this as a full department, not as the National Park Service, as the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This climate change impact is too big and too all-encompassing and affecting all of our resources that we need to work together. We need to break down the silos. That's an enormous change for the Department of the Interior, but it's embodied in the climate change secretarial order. How do we do that? Very specifically, let's bring first science to the table. Let's not talk about this in an abstract or purely anecdotal way. Let's get the science brought down to the regional level to find out what the impacts on the resources are. Hence, the development of regional science centers. We are now underway developing that. We have a tremendous head start because through the enlightened leadership of Chairman Norm Dix in particular, Congress has already approved on the wildlife side funding for regional science and national science on wildlife impacts. And we are going to build on that by bringing in additional resources from other agencies and having regional centers that look at wildlife impacts as well as other impacts on water resources, et cetera. We're in the process of identifying where those locations will be for those regional science centers. Another very important aspect that is breathed through this entire secretarial order is that it's not just interior. It can't be just interior. And that's certainly true for science at the start. These science centers will not necessarily be at interior locations. They may be located at major research universities. In fact, many of them will. They will include the science of our fellow agencies, the NOAAs of the world, the Forest Service of the world, who have very good science capabilities to bring to the table. And they will include outreach to state and local folks who have to understand how to react and, first of all, understand the impacts that climate change is having on the resources of the region. So these regional science centers will help step down to a regional level those major modeling exercises, step it down to a regional level, and then talk about what resources are going to be impacted. That's step one in the secretarial order. Step two is to then bring that science to folks who have to make resource decisions on the ground. That means the Interior Department, to be sure, because of our big footprint. That also means our state partners. That means local communities who are worried about their water supply. It means sportsmen groups who are worried about impacts on hunting and fishing possibilities. How do we do that? The concept is borrowed from the Fish and Wildlife Service, landscape conservation cooperatives, where the Interior Department will help trigger, but not dominate, trigger community-based cooperatives which bring together the folks who have to make resource decisions in an area and help them figure out how to work together to respond to sea rise, to respond to wildlife impacts, et cetera. It's a bold, creative, and yes, experimental process. It's going to need your help in order to work. And Sam Hamilton, who's been key to some of the thinking of this, will talk about this briefly as well. Those are some of the building blocks on the adaptation side. And centered within these regional science centers and the landscape conservation cooperatives are going to be the necessity to make sure that when we gather new science, it's brought into the equation, and we do so efficiently and effectively across the entire federal government and with state partners. And by the way, we're working very closely with the Western governors on that score as we have an MOU signed this summer by Secretary Salazar to work on wildlife corridor identification and protection. So bringing the science together, and then as we figure out what's the best way to adapt, whether it is to, for example, for sea rise, to form new wetlands, to have green architecture to respond to wetlands, as I look at Rebecca Waters across the audience here, or another strategy. We need to share that information as well, and we're committed to finding platforms to do that. Let me finally move to a couple of other items in the secretarial order that I think bear attention and are relevant to some of the topics raised in the first panel. We've been talking here about adaptation. This recent secretarial order also talks about the mitigation side of things. Now, the front line of defense for mitigation is what the whole panel this morning talked about, which is shifting our economy away from fossil fuel-based energy to renewables. That's obviously a huge priority for us. But also in the secretarial order on climate change, you'll find two other techniques of mitigation that are very important to the Department of the Interior where we'd like to work with you. One is on geological carbon sequestration. Under the 2007 Energy Act, the USGS, our science arm, was charged with defining methodologies for identifying good places to do geologic carbon sequestration. The USGS announced their methodology in June, and we are looking forward and are working with the Department of Energy and industry folks to put that application in practice. We're looking to use some BLM lands as experimental places to do geologic carbon sequestration. That's a very important mitigation opportunity because, as you know, if we can take the carbon out of coal and store it, that can help us bridge to our new energy economy. Number two, and very exciting, is biological carbon sequestration. The same act that Secretary, then Senator Salazar, championed in 2007 asked the USGS to do a national analysis of our landscapes and how much carbon is being essentially absorbed into our landscapes through natural processes, through our wetlands, through our forests, etc. We are proceeding with that with very significant progress and expect to have an announcement by early December that will essentially be a national inventory of how much carbon is being absorbed by our natural landscapes, both in terms of the snapshot today, but it also will give an indication and an estimate of how much additional carbon could be stored through our natural systems based on the combination of satellite imagery and ground truthing that is underway at the USGS and our partners at the Forest Service. Very exciting stuff. Stay tuned. Finally, the final mitigation element of that secretarial order deals with the carbon footprint issue that came up in the last panel. As the Secretary mentioned, Assistant Secretary Rhea Su is developing protocols to bring together all of our all of our bureaus and agencies at the department to have common metrics and goals for energy efficiency, for changing our mix of energy, to make sure that every time you go to a national park, you're going to see solar panels on the roof and stuff like that, which is extraordinarily important in terms of demonstrating that we are going to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So I'll close there, and I'll look forward to questions. I'm going to turn it over to Sam Hamilton, the Director of our Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank you.
Well, good morning. It's a great honor to be here today representing 10,000 Fish and Wildlife Service employees who are scattered all over the country, spending countless hours trying to conserve America's wildlife. Thank you, Secretary Salazar, for having me be part of this great team that you've assembled. This is one of the most exciting times, yet one of the most daunting times I think I've seen in my 30-year career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Many, many challenges. As you heard David Hayes speak about how the department's organizing around this salient issue of climate change, and Kit talking about the reality of it. It's not science fiction. It is true science being put to use on the ground and guiding our actions today, and it's a very sobering task ahead of us. You know, you look back, you have to look back to look forward, and sometimes when you look back, you look at America's heroes, and I think back, people like Teddy Roosevelt, and back in the early 1900s, there were big challenges back then. The conservation community, the hunting, fishing, outdoor enthusiasts recognized that, you know, America was facing some very big challenges facing our natural resources. And at that time, there was plume hunting going on, and Roosevelt looked around and said, what can we do to really protect birds in America? What can we do in a bold way for conservation? So he looked at a piece of real estate in South Florida, and he set aside, at that point, he looked and said, well, there are a couple of acres out here that are covered up with birds. Why can't we establish this as a bird sanctuary? And why can't we begin to establish areas for wildlife in this country? His staff said, there's no reason why you can't do it. He said, so be it. And the first refuge was established at Pelican Island. The significance of that is that small step at that point in time, at a time when the economy was hurting, at a time when we had no wildlife conservation really going on in a serious way in America, he took that first step. And today we have 500 national wildlife refuges. We went from 2 acres to 150 million acres. So it's the men, women, sportsmen and women, and conservationists all across this country who were the first to speak out and see the fact that Something had to be done for wildlife. And it's those same people today that are observing changes across the landscape that have us all concerned about wildlife. For example, shifting migrations. You heard a little bit about that. But as food changes on the landscape, we see broad changes in wildlife migrations across the country. Not only abundance of wildlife, but changes in species composition. And I was down in Mississippi not long ago and noticing that we had roseate spoonbills, a species that was commonly found and is commonly found along the coast on the Gulf Coast, now far inland, not far south of Memphis, Tennessee. Amazing shifts. We have dwindling populations in rivers and lakes of fisheries all across America. And we have rising sea level issues that are not only putting communities at risk, but drowning out, as we saw at Alligator River Refuge, wildlife habitat. And in fact, we have 177 national wildlife refuges on the coast of America. And we expect over the next 100 years maybe to lose 1 million acres of that land that was set aside for conservation. Now, if that doesn't scare you enough, one of the things that, is the heart and soul to this agency is waterfowl management. And there are projections now that 42% reduction in the wetlands in the prairie pothole region that could affect 70% of the breeding waterfowl in this country. We've got expanding ranges of insects, as you heard Kit reference. That changes the forage base for big game populations in this country. Could have a devastating effect. And then, of course, threatened and endangered species. Many of you, whether you're dealing with energy projects or alternative energy, you come face to face with the Endangered Species Act. Many of those species are living on the edge of extinction today. And what is a 1-degree climate change going to do for those? This is truly a game changer for wildlife conservation in this country. Secretary Salazar has challenged us to think bold, think big, to leverage partnerships to try to get done what needs to be done to set this country in the right direction when it comes to facing up to climate change and the implications. Now, one of those is alternative energy. You heard a great discussion about that. You heard some discussion about the wildlife effects, and maybe there are some obstacles, and there will be obstacles. There are no free rides when it comes to any energy development. We have to be smart about it. We have to have a lot of thought. There are places for alternative energy, and there are places that they're not. And the good news is that we are now at the table, I would say for the first time in quite some time, at the table when those discussions are happening from the very beginning, and we can have input and early planning and make a difference so that we can get these alternative sites developed very quickly. But I do believe as wildlife goes in this country, so goes the nation. And that's a big, big statement, but it's the heart of what this agency is all about. This is a foundational issue of the quality of life as well as the economy of this country. Healthy ecosystems mean a healthy economy. Now, the DOI strategy, the department's strategy, is based with a clear vision based on sound science and adaptive landscape scale conservation and collaboration with our partners. Now, we have a strategic plan. We're proud of that. It was developed by career employees. We started 18 months ago. It's out for public comment now. It guides where this agency believes we ought to go over the next 50 years. It's built on the principles of adaptation, mitigation, and engagement. Engagement of the American people, both in terms of education, but also outreach. Foundational to the whole thing are landscape conservation cooperatives that David mentioned. These are an exciting part of the agenda of what we are going to be working very seriously on across the United States, engaging our stakeholders, landscape conservation, putting science on the ground where the action is and where it needs to be done. Wildlife don't know borders. They don't know state borders. They don't know site-specific borders. They're going to need to migrate. They're going to need to adapt. And landscape conservation, and through these cooperatives, we hope to put the planning and design to set that in motion for the future. We believe that there's a need for a national wildlife adaptation strategy as called for in the House and the Senate. In both of the bills that have been introduced, we believe a national wildlife adaptation is critical to help form the partnerships that will guide our actions in the future. And we all need to reduce our carbon footprint, and our strategy talks about how we intend to do that. We haven't waited around. A decade ago, and you heard a little bit about biological carbon sequestration. I personally got involved in that a decade ago. We're proud of the accomplishments that we did in the lower Mississippi Valley. We're now seeing success all across the United States. Partnering with 40 different energy companies, many NGOs, the Conservation Fund, Trust for Public Lands, and others. We planted 33 million trees, native hardwoods, restoring the lower Mississippi Delta. And in doing so, we believe that we can sequester 20 million metric tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. We've added 80,000 acres to the National Wildlife Refuge System, and we believe it's a way of a win-win deal, restoring natural ecosystems as well as sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. The last area, and I'll skip over a couple just for time's sake, polar bears. Recently we designated 250,000 acres of the North Slope, proposed that for critical habitat for the polar bear. Not a shining success story. Not a shining success story, but important because it highlights the fact that, you know, this ecosystem on the North Slope is in critical trouble. As sea ice melts, the polar bears are anticipated to be in big trouble over the next 50 years. So we propose designating 250,000 square miles of the Arctic for polar bears. We believe that not only the sea ice, the land, and the islands are critical in giving that bear hope in the future. So again, in closing, I think that, you know, the Department of the Interior has a significant role not only on the 20% land that we own in the United States, but the 80% working with private landowners to link those critical habitats together in a way that makes sense in the future. Look forward to working with all of you in the future. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ann Castle, and I'm incredibly privileged to serve with Secretary Salazar and the rest of this incredible team as the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science. My responsibilities include the Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Geological Survey. Of all the areas impacted by climate change, water resources may be feeling the brunt more than any other. Climate change isn't just a theoretical future possibility for water managers. They're dealing with it right now. It's impacting their operations today. The increases in temperature that are associated with climate change will cause different precipitation patterns, changing patterns of rain and snow, diminished snowpack, and more extreme storm activity. We're expecting to receive different kinds of precipitation timing, with our precipitation coming more from rain and less from snow. And that means that we'll be getting more of our runoff during the winter rains and less of our runoff during the traditional spring runoff season. And that's particularly true in high latitude areas and mountainous areas. Also, increases in temperature create more evapotranspiration from vegetation and land surface, so that the precipitation that's falling from the sky gets trapped and is used as evapotranspiration and doesn't make it into streams and rivers and lakes and reservoirs. Precipitation changes are expected to vary across the country, with some areas of the country receiving more precipitation and others less. This slide shows, it's an accumulation of various different climate models, and it shows the predicted changes in runoff over the next 50 years. And as you can see, the southwestern United States is expected to be the most heavily impacted. The crosshatched areas are the areas where there is the most certainty because the climate models agree. So we're seeing that we can expect 10 to 20% decreases in runoff in the southwestern United States, and Arizona could see a reduction as great as 40%. Most of our water management models rely on historical data to predict the future, and that's data that's been collected over the past 100 years. And we use historical averages and ranges to make decisions about our water management and operation. But obviously that reflects an assumption that we can use the past as a good predictor of the future. For example, most reservoirs were designed for patterns of runoff and flood volume within historical ranges, and we just don't know how our reservoirs are going to perform if those ranges become obsolete. Take a look at this example from California. Congresswoman Napolitano is familiar with this reservoir. This is Lake Oroville in Northern California, part of the State Water Project. The difference in these two slides is just 3 years apart. So obviously there were assumptions made in the design and construction of this reservoir that haven't held up to the 3 years of drought that California has been experiencing. Another example of predicting the future based on the past is in our estimates of future hydropower generation. And hydropower is currently our greatest source of renewable energy. We didn't talk a whole lot about it in the previous panel, but that's something that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to as part of our country's renewable energy portfolio. But we use historical averages of evaporation from lake surfaces and of lake levels to predict the amount of hydropower that various lakes and reservoirs will produce. But increased temperature is going to increase evaporation from the surface, and decreased runoff will decrease the lake levels in our reservoirs. So both of those contribute to the fact that there will be less head from the water surface to spin the turbines, and consequently less hydropower generation. We also use historical data to predict water demand. Today's crop consumption rates are based on climatic zones. Any of you who are gardeners know that we have 10 or 12 climatic zones across the country. And those climatic zones and the consumptive use rates that go with them form the basis for predicting what our irrigation water demand is. But the amount of water crops need will increase as temperatures increase. And so our demand for irrigation water is going to increase as well. So we obviously need to adapt our water management and our water operations practices to deal with climate change. And doing that requires us also to factor in the other challenges that water managers are facing. We're obviously increasing in population. That's going to increase our water demand. And the population increase is greatest in the southwestern part of our country, where the impact of climate change on our water supplies is also the greatest. As we encourage new energy production, both conventional and renewable, as we talked about in the previous panel, all of that requires new sources of water supply. We also have aging infrastructure issues. Much of the water distribution systems, the water projects in this country were built 50 or even 100 years ago, and they're simply not as efficient as the water systems that are being built today. But our investment in new infrastructure, in repair of aging infrastructure, gives us the opportunity to use new technology that will make us smarter about managing our water and decrease waste and leaks. A great deal of work is also being done to identify alternative energy sources for energy, or alternative water sources for energy production, like using treated wastewater or brackish or saline water for water cooling for energy production. And we need to take into account the water footprint, not just the carbon footprint of new energy technologies when we're evaluating their feasibility. We need to avoid having our new alternative energy economy run smack into a buzzsaw of water shortage. We also can't balance our water demand and supply equation without water conservation and demand reduction. And the Department of the Interior can provide the federal leadership that's needed on conservation techniques and how to adapt to climate change. The Bureau of Reclamation is funding basin studies that will incorporate climate change into predictions of future water supplies. And the U.S. Geological Survey is building the capacity to close the gap between existing climate models and the downscaled type of information that water managers need in order to be able to estimate and operate for the future. Future generations aren't going to give us separate grades on how we handle water shortage and how we handle climate issues. They're going to judge us on whether they've inherited an adequate supply of clean water. The Department of the Interior is trying to do its best to ensure that we've provided that inheritance. And with that, let me introduce Assistant Secretary Larry Echohawk, our wonderful Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs.
My name is Larry Echohawk. I serve as the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, and for the past 14 years, I've served as a law professor at Brigham Young University, and so as I begin, I'm going to probably sound a little bit like a law professor. That's what I feel comfortable in talking about, but I think it needs to be said that in the United States Constitution, Indian tribes were not described in detail in terms of their governmental authority. And the relationship that Indian tribes have with the federal government and states were not addressed in definitive terms by the Constitution. So that was left to the courts of the United States. And the key U.S. Supreme Court cases came beginning in 1831. In a case called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the U.S. Supreme Court determined that Indian tribes were domestic dependent nations. And the key part of that ruling is the word nation. The U.S. Supreme Court recognized that Indian tribes were nations. And in further describing this relationship, the U.S. Supreme Court says, speaking of tribes, the relation of the United States resembles that of a ward to his guardian. And that kind of goes back to that word dependent, domestic dependent nation. And what did that have to do about? Well, the court there said it only resembled the guardian-ward relationship. But over time, with numerous treaties and statutes and more Supreme Court cases being decided, it finally reached the point where in American law, the relationship was described as a trust responsibility of the United States, owed to Native people, Indian tribes, to protect their lands and resources. And this would include 56 million acres of land today held in trust for Native Americans. That includes tribal lands, but there are also about 11 million acres of individual Indian allotments that are held in trust by the United States. In addition to those lands, there are about 44 million acres of non-trust lands in the state of Alaska held by Alaska Native corporations. So you can do the math on that. We're talking like 100 million acres of lands. But in addition to that, I think one of the key things to point out is that Native people have a greater interest beyond just that 100 million acres of land. And what I'm speaking of is treaty rights, because treaty rights extend beyond reservation boundaries, beyond territorial boundaries. And I'll give you a couple examples. The one I'm most familiar with is the tribe that I served as their Chief General Legal Counsel for 9 years, the Shoshone-Bannock Nation on the Fort Hall Indian Reservation in Idaho. Originally, their Aboriginal territory included 33 million acres of land. And by treaty in 1868, the Fort Bridger Treaty, the tribes gave up their land Aboriginal lands and were placed on a smaller reservation of 1.6 million acres. But in Article 4 of that treaty, the United States of America said in the written language that the tribes reserve to themselves the right to hunt on the unoccupied lands of the United States. The right to hunt on the unoccupied lands of the United States. That treaty has also been interpreted not to mean just hunting, but also fishing. And like in the case of many tribes, as the tribe made further cessions of land, they reserved to themselves the right to go off of their reservation to gather other food sources and to go to sacred areas and also to graze livestock. So tribes have very significant rights that extend beyond territorial boundaries. Perhaps even more notable would be the series of treaties entered into in 1854 and 1855 in the Washington Territory, where the tribes reserved the right of taking fish at usual and accustomed grounds and stations in common with the citizens of the territory. In 1979, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the tribes had the right to take up to 50% of harvestable fish that passed through tribal fishing grounds. And thus, American Indians and Alaskan Natives have rights to manage and to use natural resources on much more than 100 million acres of land in the United States. So when we talk about climate change, we're talking about significant risk and threats that are posed to Native people. So they're vitally concerned about climate change impacts, and Native people must be consulted on a government-to-government basis. This is in the law by executive order that federal departments and agencies must consult with Native people. Also, Indian tribes must be participants in the formulation and implementation of climate change policies. Secretarial Order 3289, addressing the impacts of climate change, was signed on September 14th of this year. In Section 5, Section 5 was dedicated to American Indians and Alaskan Natives and can be paraphrased as follows. It recognizes the disproportionate effect climate change has on tribes and their lands. It recognizes trust responsibility and the need for government-to-government consultations on climate change. And it supports substantive participation by tribes in the development of agreements, rules, and regulations on climate change. It also supports best available science, which includes traditional ecological knowledge of Native people. And for centuries, American Indians and Alaskan Natives have been the stewards of natural resources. And tribes have accumulated traditional knowledge, and they have acute sensitivity to the changes in the environment. And surely Native people have been among the first to notice changes caused by climate, changes in the climate. So today, many tribes, besides that traditional knowledge, also have sophisticated resource management capability that is based upon scientific research and data. So in conclusion, I just want to emphasize that there must be government-to-government consultation with tribal nations. And this is not within only the Department of the Interior. It includes other departments of the federal government like Commerce, Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy, as an example. And tribal governments must have substantive participation in the development of departmental policy, objectives, and initiatives regarding climate change. Tribal nations must have increased access to expertise and scientific research of the departments. And there must be increased monitoring of climate change indicators at the tribal level. And there are 564 tribal nations, and they're all different. One size does not fit all. Many of the tribes have the capability, because they have financial resources, to be able to do what they need to do to protect their lands and resources and their treaty rights. But other tribal nations will need financial assistance to be able to participate as they should as tribal nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry Ann and Sam and David and Kit. And with that, we'll open it up for questions. And since I left this side out last time, we're going to start right here. Yes.
University of New Mexico, thank you. I wanted to ask about two areas of mitigation on DOI lands, and one of those would be from oil and gas developments where there are substantial amounts of greenhouse gases, and the other is with respect to water projects, reclamation water projects where, again, large quantities of energy are used for lifting and piping water, and wondered if alternative energies have been explored for that energy use. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. David, why don't you take a UNN?
Okay, thank you. I'll deal with the first question. It's a very important point, and typically the leases between the Interior Department and oil and gas developers have not focused on emissions, and there are some real opportunities there. And in fact, Ned Farquhar, whom the Secretary introduced earlier, has been looking into some potential initiatives dealing with methane emissions, for example. So we're going to be reaching out to industry and looking at our leasing structure and seeing what opportunities we can provide. I should mention that that ties in really to a government-wide effort to look at the government footprint on climate change. In addition to the Secretary's order, the President put out an executive order this fall on federal government reducing its footprint. Part of that deals with a question of whether our lessees should also be counted and their emissions should be counted. One way or another, we're going to tackle that issue, and we're in discussions with the Council on Environmental Quality on that right now. But whether we do it as part of that government-wide initiative or our own initiative, you're right, there's some great opportunities there for emissions reductions, and we'll be looking forward to working with our lessees toward that end.
And the water issue.
Your question points out a very significant fact, and that is that we use an incredible amount of energy in this country to push water around. And that's something I think we're, as a country, just starting to tumble to. One of the first ways that we can deal with that is with water conservation, because if we use less water, then we need less energy to push it around. And the department will be taking the lead, and has been taking the lead through the Bureau of Reclamation, on a water conservation initiative to try to facilitate conservation, recycling, and reuse projects throughout the country. We're also putting together a partnership with the Department of Energy to look at additional hydropower generation on existing reclamation facilities and exploring low-head hydro, in-canal hydro, run-of-the-river type projects that don't require significant new facilities, but that can be used then to power the operations that are associated with water distribution.
Thank you, Ann. All the way to the back. Right there.
Hi, I'm John Kostiak with the National Wildlife Federation. I lead up our adaptation efforts, but I find that the adaptation and mitigation agendas continue to overlap, and it's kind of hard to do one without the other anymore. And so I thought the Assistant Secretary did a wonderful job highlighting the water impacts of some renewables development, and how, and I think we need to think hard about that. But also, I think that transmission is another one of the big environmental impacts we have to deal with as we build out a renewable sector. And I'm wondering whether the department has begun a prioritization process. I think it was you, Mr. Secretary, who highlighted the enormous benefits of offshore wind in the Mid-Atlantic, which has minimal transmission impacts to the environment compared to, say, building transmission across the eastern U.S. on the land. And so it seems to me, although it's sort of different bureaus and agencies within the department that are handling onshore versus offshore, there needs to be a real analysis of what goes first in terms of impacts of building out this energy sector. And one of the key considerations being looking at the need for wildlife corridors and other forms of wildlife adaptation.
Let me just very quickly answer the question. You're exactly right, and I think what happened in the prior administration, and some of you may be allies of the prior administration, is that all of this was happening essentially helter-skelter without any kind of planning. And just like was mentioned in the earlier panel today, our efforts to try to be proactive with solar development so we can develop solar in the right places without impacting the conservation values, which we also have the responsibility to protect. We have to do that across the board, and certainly looking at how we do that, both offshore and onshore, will continue to be a major priority of ours. For most of our people, they have been not on, confirmed only in the last couple of months, but we get your point, and we're working at it. We're working at it very, very hard. I had a conversation actually with Tom Strickland and David last week about how on the onshore we have moved very fast with respect to development of renewable energy, and have done it in a way where we're working hand in glove with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We need to do something similar to that in the outer continental shelf, especially in the Atlantic area where there is such a significant interest on how we move forward there. And so we've had conversations about perhaps standing up an additional permitting office that will be focused on offshore wind on the Atlantic. All right, you guys, so y'all came with great questions. All right, back here.
Hi, I'm Dean Allen. I'm the CEO of McKinstry Company in Seattle, Washington. We do energy efficiency and renewable work throughout the West. And all the conversations in the first session, we talked a lot about using the Interior's opportunity for scale and renewables. A lot of our customers are small communities and school districts that are more and more looking to biomass boilers, and including biomass boilers for electrical generation. I was just curious what kinds of strategies you have to let us think globally but act locally.
Okay, David, you want to take that?
Sure. There are tremendous biomass opportunities, and it's part of our mix as well. We are working with the Forest Service, for example, in connection with our fire mitigation program. There are very interesting opportunities as we thin areas in the wildland-urban interface and take out biomass to convert that into energy. We've had discussions with the Department of Energy, with the Forest Service about that. We're also looking in connection with some initiatives we've had in Oregon, for example, recently, looking at biomass opportunities and taking advantage of the double hit there of providing jobs in the forests and also energy production. So it's a key part of our work, and appreciate you raising the point.
Here's what I'm going to do. How many, let's do the hands again of who has questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, about 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 questions. Okay. Say your name. Say your name. I'm gonna write down all the names, and then we'll go around, and 20 seconds apiece. Tony. Okay. Who else was next? If you don't give me your name now, we won't. Oh, hold on. Tony was there.
Devon.
Oh, hold on. I'm gonna go down here. Monique. Okay, and then yes, sir. Dean. Okay, and then moving across. Arthur, and then? Yes. First name? Mead, M-E-A-D, like in Lake Mead. Okay, yes, at the back.
Chris Wood.
Chris, okay. The back.
Wahala.
First name?
Wahala.
Wahala? Wahala. Okay, Wahala. Okay. Coming across. Deb Hahn. Deb, okay. Coming across. David. Okay. And then in the back, blue shirt. First name?
Fawn.
Fawn. Okay, Fawn. And next to you, Fawn?
I'm Kevin Hurst.
Evan. Okay, I've taken care of the right side of the house. I go to the left side of the house. Terry. In the very back.
David Moulton.
David. Okay. Let me see who else. Right here in the front.
Mira, M-E-E-R-A.
Mira. Okay.
Audrey Peterman.
Audrey. Audrey. Okay. Bob. Front. Sorry.
Mike Williams, Alaska.
Mike Williams, Alaska.
Roger Johnson.
Roger Johnson. Okay.
Derek Brockbank.
Derek. Okay. The back.
Mary Tracy.
Mary Tracy. One more in the back. Aquila. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to call on you. There's about 20. One more, okay? Deborah. Okay. We are going to try to work through these 20.
Got it on the front.
Yes. Ralph. Okay. Wait, I'm going to ask you again if you can, and you know we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to take 15 minutes. It is absolutely for us as important it is for me to hear our people because I think they are wonderful and I think they've done a wonderful job. It is more importantly, frankly, for us to hear from you because we learn from you. And so I didn't want you to come here without you having an opportunity to at least give us your comment. So, but I'm going to ask you to keep it short, okay? Because we don't have a lot of time. So 15, 20 seconds to make your comment. I'm going to call on you by name. So Tony.
Tony Willardson. I'm the Executive Director of the Western States Water Council, affiliated with Western Governors Association. I want to raise the issue of water supply, and as has been mentioned, climate change and regional scaling. Our models are improving, but we're not there yet. But the department is very important with the science that we gather now through stream gauging networks, all through infrared imaging and ET, working with NASA and other agencies, and how important it is that we continue to maintain our existing networks as far as information on water supply.
Okay.
And the other agencies as the U.S. Forest Service and SNOTEL system.
Thank you, Tony. Monique.
If tribes are to develop a tribal economy and fairly compete with the infrastructure provided by local governments through their tax bases, then tribes must be able to access the capital markets either through municipal bonds, infrastructure funds, or some other comparable means. Thank you.
Okay. Dean. Just go really loud. We can hear you. And
Get your energy
is there
in.
another microphone?
I'm Dean Bibles.
Yeah, Dean. Well, Arthur, you're on board after you. So somebody get the microphone to Arthur, and then following Arthur, Mead. Go ahead, Dean.
Okay. I'm just representing me. I spent about 43 years in the Department of the Interior, primarily in BLM. I want to say I have tremendous respect for the Interior Department employees for always, regardless of the administration, they've always come forth, and maybe too well at times, and so we produce so much of the coal and oil that have caused some of the problem. But in this instance, I am very concerned about the distance from where the power is needed. David Hales mentioned putting solar generators on the rooftops of the Park Service buildings. I see the big Eros building in the picture that could stand it. As I look at all the big box stores and all of the hangars and warehouses and the open spaces in our airports and the space that right where the energy is needed.
Your point, Dean, is
Okay.
transmission and location siting.
Yes, and the capability to put the power closer to where it's needed, even in private homes where the connection into the grid is an expensive proposition,
Okay.
but it needs the technical capability.
We got
And
your
the
point.
other
Thank
is
you,
just
Dean.
a quick one, is the,
Oh, no, you only get one.
okay.
You give me the other one later on. Arthur.
Arthur Halbenstock with Bright Source Energy. We have the world's largest solar thermal contracts. We are dry-cooled. Our technology team uses a fraction of the water that other technologies use, and also built and designed that solar power plant that you flew over, Mr. Secretary. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your leadership. Our Ivanpah project will double the amount of solar in the country, large-scale solar in the country, and we're very excited about that. But we recognize development in the desert, no matter where it is going to have a significant environmental impact. How can large-scale solar help to mitigate the types of adaptation problems that we talked about today?
Okay, thank you, Arthur. Mead. And following Mead, we'll have Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm Mead Treadwell. I chair the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. I just wanted to point 3 areas where the department plays a very strong role in research and could play a stronger role. First is in monitoring. In the Arctic, as Kit mentioned, 20%, 25% of the terrestrial carbon embedded in the world is in the Arctic, and we need to have funding restored for the North Slope Science Initiative and some other cooperative efforts there with state and federal agencies on monitoring. Second, one of the reasons why the ice is receding faster in the Arctic is because of soot. And the department's fire policy and research and cooperation with other countries, especially in Asia, might be able to help stem the melting of the ice in the polar ice cap. And that's an initiative that the administration's working on now, and Interior could help on a lot.
Okay, thank you, Mead.
And third is oil spill research.
Oil
that
spill.
ocean's becoming more accessible. We collect 9 cents a barrel for all the oil used in this country, and we need to spend more on oil and ice research.
Okay, thank you, Mead. Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm Chris Wood with Trout Unlimited. We're one of 400 groups that formed something called Sportsmen for Responsible Energy Development in response to the energy development practices of the past decade. And one of the concerns that many of our groups have is that we're going to be putting a whole host of new development on the landscape when we haven't addressed some of the basic infirmities underlying oil and gas development on public lands. And I'd be curious to hear what kind of plans you have for correcting those. Thank you.
Thank you. Waila?
Hi, my name is Wahala. I have a question in regards to, I come from a community that has gone through 30 years of coal mining, and the potential of using these lands that have gone through reclamation.
Which community?
Black Mesa in
Black Mesa.
Navajo Nation region. And if there's potential for renewable energy assessment that has been done on reclamation lands under the Office of Surface Mining or Bureau of Reclamation, that's one question. And the process for Arizona being at 40% in drought condition in the future, is there a process for going through conserving water? Because coal-fired power plants, you know, just one alone in our region uses anywhere from 1,400 to 2,700 acre-feet of water. And what are you doing about, you know, thinking about, talking about community conservation on that?
Okay, thank you, Wahala. Now I'm going to move on to Deb.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Deb Hahn, I work for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, representing the state fish and wildlife agencies. And when it comes to renewable energy development, we just would like to encourage the administration to work early and often with the state fish and wildlife agencies. We do have good relationships with the Department of the Interior, but when it comes to natural resources protection, the states and the federal agencies partnering with industry is the best way to get the need for energy on the ground while protecting our natural resources. And you know, there was a lot of talk in the last discussion about streamlining and of putting transmission and other energy on the ground, which is important. However, we need to continue to consider what that means for our natural resources as we do that.
Okay.
And that has to do with also funding for climate change adaptation for states and federal agencies and making sure that is well funded.
Okay, thank you, Deb. David?
My name is David Wunsch. I'm the president of the Association of American State Geologists, and I'll echo the comments of my colleague here to the left. But there's a lot of DOI lands, of course, west of the Mississippi, but there's not a lot very to the east. But one thing all states do have is environmental cabinets, fish and wildlife, and also geological surveys, which is what I represent. But there's a lot of scientists on the ground collecting information, and I think partnerships would really help some of the issues that were brought up earlier about being able to permit things in a timely manner, having the data that we need to make wise choices, that we don't go too fast and putting up things that are in inappropriate sites. And one comment following up on that, on a bright note, is last week it was announced by Department of Energy that they are sharing $17 million with a consortium of 40 geological surveys to build a geothermal database, information that'll help to look for hotspots, pun intended, for enhanced and engineered geothermal systems and other things like that.
Thank you, David. Fawn?
Good afternoon. My name is Fawn Sharp from the Quinault Nation. I had a question that related to tribal deference in public policy making as well as governance, and I do appreciate your order, Secretary, on giving tribal substantive participation. I would just like to note that with regard to the Regional Science Center and the Landscape Conservation Co-ops, if tribes could be given deference to the traditional knowledge that is inherent in tribal communities as those adaptation strategies emerge, that's going to be very critical. We believe that time is of the essence. In the next 20 years, when the glaciers are melting in the park, there's going to be a desperation for solutions, that all the clean technology in the world is going to solve only a fraction of the problem. But to truly solve this global crisis, we're going to draw on all forms of knowledge, including traditional cultural knowledge. Tribal communities are the most carbon-based, carbon-neutral societies in the world, and we have a lot to offer, not only solutions, but solutions proven through centuries. And we believe that those solutions need to be developed now with funding and brought forward in the next 10 to 20 years to share with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Fawn. Evan?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate the opportunity to make a few comments. Thanks for this forum, particularly interesting. The National Wildlife Refuge Association represents tens of thousands of volunteers and National Wildlife Refuge Friends groups around the country who are focused on supporting our refuges. 20% of the workload on the refuge system gets done because of those volunteers. My question is this. There's a lot of discussion about adaptation funding for Fish and Wildlife and other agencies to anticipate what's coming down the pike and how to respond to that. But in response to earlier comments about streamlining the NEPA process, there's also a particular need for Fish and Wildlife Service to have the resources to be able to make the science available to develop valuable and accurate assessments of what these energy projects are going to mean for wildlife. And so it's important from our perspective that those resources be made available.
Thank you, Terry. David? We go over to the left now. We still have 14 more, so keep them coming.
Thank you. I'm Terry Williams from the Tulalip Tribes, and during the Clinton administration, I worked for Carol Browner to establish the first Indian office, and as I went across the country meeting with the tribes, I was told that the United States didn't know what they did to themselves when it comes to environmental management. And the paper I left you at the break is a response from the tribes nationally. We organized the time to be able to pull together the interest in where we're headed, including a request to be involved in the Copenhagen discussions coming up. And I'll let you read through it, but if there are any questions, please call us and we'll be glad to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Mira.
Thank you. My name is Mira Kohler, and I'm the CEO of Alaska Village Electric Co-op. We're a nonprofit utility that serves 53 villages across the vast areas of Alaska. I do need to point out that to serve these 53 villages with an average population of 400, we have 48 diesel-powered plants because there really is no other option. We are icebound for 6 to 8 months of the year. Everything has to be either flown in or barged in. Power costs 60 cents a kilowatt hour and higher. Diesel costs $6 a gallon and higher. Our villages are mostly on honey buckets, have very limited water sources. We have some real serious issues out in rural Alaska. Please don't forget us. And as you are developing policies and projects to serve the country, make sure that we sustain these villages and their way of lives because they are an absolute critical element of the fabric of Alaska. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira. Audrey?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My name is Audrey Peterman, and I'm president and co-founder with my husband Frank of an environmental consulting and publishing firm based in Atlanta called Earthwise Productions. Our focus is on engaging communities of color with the public land system. And I'm really heartened and excited to see the trajectory in which you're going. I mean, there's so much exciting stuff happening here today that I didn't know about, even though I make it my business to know about what's going on in the public land system. My question to you is, I can walk down the streets of Atlanta or perhaps out here in DC and talk to any random person with an average education and mention the public land system, and they might not have a clue what I'm talking about. Really. People don't even know there's a national park system. The public land system does not resonate at the level of diversity in the urban core. And since this is the fastest growing demographic segment of the population, young people, communities of color, I want to know what level of importance the DOI attaches to getting these people information and engaging them, since, you know, principally we're the people who are going to be doing the conserving and or the voting about our public land system.
We got your point loud and clear, Audrey. Thank you very much. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Bob Urban, Defenders for Wildlife.
climate change adaptation is a key issue, and clearly developing renewable energy is going to be important to climate change mitigation. But the result is going to be, in some cases, fragmentation of habitat, particularly for endangered species. And I'm interested in knowing what steps will be taken to prevent the conservation of endangered species and the Endangered Species Act from being labeled as the roadblock to renewable energy or a scapegoat, when in fact it often represents the last resort when our other policies have failed.
Thank you, Bob. Mike?
I'm Mike Williams, Chairman of the Alaska Intertribal Council. Our people, our indigenous people in Alaska, are suffering and dying from the issue of climate change right now as I speak, as we are meeting here. The hunting and fishing rights have been extinguished, and we need to restore those hunting and fishing rights, and also the issue of jurisdiction, because we are 229 sovereigns without any land base, and we need to have that jurisdiction be issued if we're going to do our impact on climate change. The Arctic is getting a big brunt of all of the bad stuff that are coming into the Arctic and falling into our rivers and our food chain. So very, very important that you have that government-to-government talks with our federally recognized tribes in Alaska. Thank you for this conference.
Okay. Roger.
Yes, Roger Johnson, President, National Farmers Union. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and the panel. The morning was extraordinary, and I think we were all impressed by the effort, by the intelligence, by the level of commitment that you all have shown here. I have one major concern. I am afraid that we are losing the climate battle in terms of what's going on in the Congress right now. And all of the great effort that you've been talking about here, the one request I have is let's do as good a job as we can in getting that out to the public. The public is beginning to believe less in the science, and they ought to be believing more in the science. And so we just need to do a better job of outreach.
Thank you,
Again,
Roger.
thanks for your commitment.
Derek.
Hi, thank you. Derek Brockbank with National Wildlife Federation. Green jobs are a big issue right now, and they're often seen as development of clean energy, wind turbine, solar power. There's a huge potential in creating green jobs to restore the land, to do conservation, invasive species removal. I'd be interested in hearing more about how green jobs can go together with adaptation.
Thank you very much, Derek. Mary? Tom Strickland, will you come up here?
Yes, Mary Tracy from Scenic America. I want to thank the panel for a very informative, inspiring presentation. And the point that I just want to raise is the issue of scenic conservation. I think the reference to Teddy Roosevelt was great, and I think besides saving wildlife, he was just so impressed with the staggering beauty of our country. And we want to be very sure that when we bring in these new kinds of energies, that we are very careful to also measure the scenic conservations. While we're looking at the wildlife identification and protection, can we please look at scenic identification and protection as well? And I'd also ask that when we're thinking about how to get the energy from these very delicate areas to where they belong, that we use this opportunity to really use new innovations in undergrounding and whatever ways we can that are new and that are different, and will preserve that visual space. Thank you.
Akila.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, the panel. I have a question about the Water Conservation Initiative. I come from the state of California. I'm the advisor to a Clean and Green Jobs Mentoring and Training Initiative. And my concern is I'm watching the effects of of climate change on urban communities and how it's increasing the gas bill and electricity bill of folks. I think also it has a lot to do with the contamination of water because of the infrastructure. But then also, I think that it also contributes to the level of suffering because people don't have access. And so I'm interested in if a part of the Water Conservation Initiative, is there a program, a social program, to help people to deal with the high levels of suffering that are contributing also to the CO2 that's in the environment.
Thank you, Killa.
I think it's
Deborah?
a sector that is missing from the whole conversation of global warming and climate change, that human beings actually contribute to the CO2 in the environment when they're
Good point. Thank you. Thank you very much, Killa. Deborah?
Hi, good morning. My name is Deborah Lekanoff. I work for the Swinomish Indian Tribal Community. It's located in western Washington in the heart of the Salish Sea. Swinomish Indian Tribal Community is one of the tribes in 2008 that received federal funding to develop a climate change impact plan. We did an assessment of what the impacts would be on our infrastructure, on our economy, as co-managers of our natural resources. We also did an assessment there and on our environment. We are a little bit of a success story and a model. We have the technical report completed. We have an opportunity to provide this type of model and technology and opportunities to other tribes who also need to do a climate change assessment so they may address an adaptation mitigation plan.
Thank you very much,
You're
Deborah.
welcome.
One more comment here. Ralph?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ralph Sampson, Jr., Chairman of the Yakama Nation. I have one comment for Ann Castle. The point you brought up about the water being held in static, I think that's going to be addressed in the tremendous abundance of fuel that's accumulated through our fire suppression. And I came from, I'm a retired Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that was my former profession, was fuels management. But if you could look to your sister agencies there and pick up that information, I think that's going to be the key to some of your water resources, is looking in that tremendous amount of fuel loading that's accumulated, and incorporate that into the hazardous fuel reduction program and into biomass plant productions.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.
I don't want anybody to move yet. You want to stay here? We have a ways to go, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Tom Strickland come in and finish it up here, and have each members of the panel summarize whatever final comments they want to talk about, as well as Tom will give you a sense of where we will be going this afternoon when Jim Messina will join us here in about an hour. I have to run to a National Economic Council meeting that I'm running a little bit late, and so that's why I'm going to excuse myself. But I want to make just one comment, and it's in response, Roger, to what you said and a few others, and that is the effort going on in Congress and in this nation for us to move forward with comprehensive energy and climate change legislation. This time, I will tell all of you here and everybody across America that President Obama and we will not fail. This is a time when we in the United States of America are called upon in a time of crisis really to lead. And yes, we are dealing with wars in places around the world, and we're dealing with an economic crisis here at home. But the energy and climate change issue is a signature issue for our nation and for our planet. And this president is committed, along with his team, to get this legislation across the finish line. Now, it's true, we still have some chapters to go on it, and there are pieces that will change as legislation changes, as it makes its way through. But I would end my comments, at least here this morning, by saying I was with a group of a couple who'd never been to Washington, D.C. before. They're very poor people. And I was taking them to the Lincoln Memorial and to the Washington Memorial and the FDR Memorial yesterday afternoon. And they said to me, in their own thoughts, these were all great leaders of our country, the founders of our country, the people who emancipated the slaves and so on and so forth. What will be Barack Obama's own legacy? Well, there will be lots of pieces of that legacy. One of them is hopefully a change in the world around us, where we do create a more peaceful world for our children and for our grandchildren and for ourselves. And here at the domestic front, we will succeed in getting a healthcare reform package through, because it is so important to the families and businesses of America. But this issue of energy and climate change, and us succeeding in turning the page on what has been essentially multi-decade, multi-party failure in moving forward with a new agenda, is one that we embrace with relish. It is not easy to do. We would not, if it was easy, somebody else would have done it a long time ago. But then we are not, in this time of change, taking on the issues because they are easy. We're taking them on because this is hard, and we will, in fact, get it done. Help me welcome the Assistant Secretary and Chief of Staff, Tom Strickland.
Thank you. Good luck with your speech.
Okay, we are approaching the lunch break. It will be an exercise in dining efficiency, because we're going to try and get you all out and back in here for 1:15 when we have Jim Messina, the Deputy Chief of Staff, will be coming with a message from the President. At this point, I'm going to start with Kit and just ask our panelists to take literally less than a minute. Let's try 30 seconds just to wrap up. After lunch, we are going to have a more interactive panel. We'd originally had some formal presentations planned from the afternoon panelists, but I think what we're going to do is make those very summary and really spend the roughly hour we have after lunch continuing this dialogue, because you all had a lot of great questions, and we really want to hear from you in greater detail and not have you limited to 20 or 30 seconds. We'll limit ourselves. Kit?
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. I just want to say that as an ecologist and as a public citizen, it's such a pleasure to work for a secretary and a president that value science and policy making as much as these gentlemen do. All of our work on climate change, be it science, be it adaptation, be it mitigation, is all based on best management practices grounded in science. And so I just wanted to let you all know that that's the case. We're looking forward to working with all of our science and management partners here in the room to really address this challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, Kit. David?
I'll be very brief. Looking forward to this afternoon. Let me just mention one thing about the public education piece and sort of getting the word out. I hope today will help in that regard. We really need your help in getting the word out on what we're doing, and we'd appreciate whatever input you have in that regard. Let me say, in addition to the renewable energy side of the equation, there's another kind of good news story that our natural landscapes provide. I alluded to it very briefly, but it's the carbon benefits of natural landscapes. That there's tremendous potential there. Planting trees really helps. Planting a lot of trees can help. We really want to get out that story. And then finally, perhaps the most important thing that came out of this meeting is we're going to get the gentleman from BrightSource together with Bob Irwin, who are trying to figure out how to get large-scale mitigation for large-scale solar. Bob's concerned about how to make sure there's not fragmentation. I think we're going to form a marriage here and solve it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
I thought we had a good discussion. Climate change is no doubt more than a generalization issue for generations to come. It's that significant. I think it calls for bold action, creativity, and innovation. We're seeing that on the alternative energy front. And I think if done properly, can certainly help us get down the road where we need to get. But it needs to be done properly. And so we're at the table. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing its part to step up and help answer some of the questions that need to be answered for threatened and endangered species, migratory birds, and the effects that it has on wildlife across the country. So I think we do need to reinvest in natural resource conservation in this country, and I believe we're off to a good start.
Thank you. Ann?
I just want to reiterate that the primary purpose of this forum is for us to hear from you, and I think that has really been occurring, and I'm very grateful for it. And what I've heard is a recognition that any solutions that we're talking about here have a broad web of impacts. There is no silver bullet, and what you are telling us is that we need to consider all the various ramifications of the actions that we're looking at, like impact on scenic resources, like impact on fragmentation of wildlife habitat, like impact on minorities in urban corridors, and impact on the tribes. So thank you for that. It's a good reminder and something that we'll take back with us.
Larry?
Remember DFT, don't forget tribes. And tribal nations are a part of the family of governments in the United States, and they're entitled to a place at the table.
Thank you. Okay, so just a word about, thank you all, panelists. Join me in a round of applause for the panelists.